They were the biggest selling rock band of the 80s. They held the center ring of the rock and roll circus through a frenzied decade marked by stadium-sized excess.
When you're the next biggest act to Michael Jackson and you've come out of nowhere, you can't expect to be level-headed. It's impossible.
We were young enough to be naive enough to use that as an excuse for everything that we did.
It was like we'd been let loose in a sweet shop.
And under the stage, it would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. There would be 60 naked girls, and I mean with nothing on.
But for Def Leppard, every successful high was undercut by staggering lows.
We weren't going to die. That wasn't going to happen to us. You know, we learned the pitfalls, supposedly.
But the partying took its toll. Alcohol drove one member out of the band.
I felt I needed to have a drink to go on stage.
And drinking drove another to an early grave.
The alcohol in his blood was double what killed John Bonham.
Def Leppard's horrific bad luck took another brutal twist with the near-fatal car crash of their drummer.
And it was almost like some weird nightmare, standing up in this field and just saying, you know, well, I've lost my arm and I'm a drummer.
Served the double shot of success and misfortune. Def Leppard may be rock's most blessed and cursed band. Tonight, the tragedy and triumph of Def Leppard on Behind the Music. In the Fast and Furious 80s, they blazed at the center of the stadium rock universe. Signed in their teens, pin-up pop stars by their early 20s, Def Leppard smashed box office records wherever they played.
We sold Detroit out faster than Led Zeppelin did. We were talking in telephone numbers now instead of like pocket money.
It wasn't such longer time before that we were still working in factories and things like this, to all of a sudden becoming the biggest thing since sliced bread.
It was just really weird. And then multiple shows, you know, 20,000 a night, doing 3 nights in a row. It was like, whoa, where did this come from?
I'm barely out of school, barely even out of diapers, and I'm sitting up there playing playing drums in a grown-up business. My childhood got condensed.
Their popularity skyrocketed with the explosion of MTV. They were the first young rockers to aggressively market themselves through music videos. And unlike many hard rock bands, Def Leppard scored big with female fans.
It was great to see 60% females at the gig. You know, they scream louder, they dance, and let's be honest, there was 5 horny men on stage that are attracted to women. I was being dragged off into some bathroom by some dirty little girl in a miniskirt, you know, and that suited me fine.
Their album Pyromania sold 10 million copies. Their follow-up Hysteria sold 15 million more. On tour, Def Leppard ruled the wide, wild world of arena rock, where their popular success was matched only by their personal excess.
You know, they had carte blanche. They had everything they wanted. Plus, they had people shoving drinks in their faces, putting lines up their noses.
But I mean, they really were the party band. All these bands, you know, Metallica, Motley Crue, you know, you sit there and think they were so tough. I mean, you couldn't touch Def Leppard for it. It's just the fact they hid it really, really well.
They were on top of the world, but nothing could have prepared them for the series of tragedies that would haunt them in the years to come.
Rick's had a car crash, he's lost his arm. Now, this is not in the agenda. This doesn't make sense.
We didn't realise it lost it from the shoulder, and that it nearly died, nearly lost the other one as well.
Rick Allen had lost his limb, and soon Steve Clark would lose his life.
He never wanted to face his pain, is really what it boiled down to. He hurt too much.
You just see a friend almost deteriorating in front of your eyes, and you just feel so helpless.
And his heart was just, you know, beating, trying so hard to stay alive. But really, he was really slowly trying to kill himself.
Def Leppard's fateful journey began in Sheffield, England in 1977. Rock and roll was their chance to escape a dismal future in the steel mills.
We were so desperate to get out of that whole thing. The whole industrial aspect of Sheffield was imploding. Factories were closing down, they were falling down, and we were prepared to do anything, you know, bank robbing, anything, than work in a factory.
Joe Elliott and Rick Savage joined musical forces with guitarist Pete Willis and drummer Tony Kenning. Joe had the energy and the drive. He became the band's engine.
Joe just happened to say, I've had this imaginary band for 2 years now, and I've even made posters of it. And he showed us the posters that he made, which were, I suppose, pretty tacky, but at the time they were like, what, this is brilliant. Great, we've already got the name. And I was like, we're off.
The spelling of their name was soon changed, ironically mimicking that of Led Zeppelin. But it was the addition of guitarist Steve Clark that helped Def Leppard create a sound all their own.
His audition was Freebird by Lynyrd Skynyrd, and he just did the whole thing on his own, and it was like, wow, this guy's amazing, and he looked great. He wore his guitar too low, he was too thin, and he had really long blonde hair, denim jacket with no shirt on, and he had a waist about this wide, and it was like, just amazing.
By day, they held down blue-collar jobs. After work, they rehearsed. For 9 long months, they rocked the night away in an abandoned spoon factory on Bramall Lane.
At one point, he got very desperate because I wanted to play so bad live, and that these guys just wanted to keep on rehearsing and polishing it. And I said, well, I could be here in 10 years' time and still be rehearsing this bloody spoon factory. I said, Joe, if we don't do a gig soon, that's it, I'm going to find another group.
July 18, 1978, Def Leppard's first public appearance before a crowd of 150 kids, mostly 14 and 15-year-old girls. It set the tone for the many wild years to come.
They smuggled alcohol in the bass drum to loosen the nerves a little. Only got to play about 5 numbers, but got such a response that they ended up playing more. The DJs who were running the evening had to unplug them and quieten the audience down because they kept screaming for more.
But Joe Elliott wasn't content to be a local hero. He was looking for a fast track to rock and roll stardom.
It took literally 6 shows for me to turn around to everybody else and say, I don't want to do these tiny little DOS holes for the next 3 years at the hope that an A&R man spots us. There has to be a shortcut.
Joe borrowed $250 from his father to make their own record, which sold an amazing 24,000 copies. Good fortune continued to smile on the band when a 15-year-old drummer named Rick Allen saw an article entitled, Leppard Loses Skins.
I've been playing since about 9 or 10, and I was getting really fed up with the local scene. After throwing a bag full of cymbals down the steps outside, I read this, and I asked my mum to call, and she did. And I got to meet Joe and Steve.
With Rick providing the beat, Def Leppard burst onto the hard rock scene like seasoned veterans, though their average age was only 18.
For a band our age, there's nobody to touch us. That was our thing. And in fairness, I still to this day don't think there was.
By August 1979, just 12 months after their first gig, the boys signed a record deal and released their first album, On Through the Night. Touring in support of bands like AC/DC and Sammy Hagar, their high-energy stage act was an immediate hit.
They were absolutely brilliant, very colourful, very energetic. It was all action. In fact, in a way, it kind of prefigured a lot of the kind of rock bands that we got used to in the 80s. You know, in the 70s, they'd tend to stand fairly still, and Leppard clearly weren't like that. They really were like puppies just let loose.
In early 1981, Def Leppard began recording their second album, High and Dry, marking the start of their collaboration with producer Mutt Lange, a studio perfectionist who became the unofficial sixth Leppard. But trouble was brewing, and as they toured the U.S. with Ozzy Osbourne, guitarist Pete Willis found himself increasingly out of step with the band.
Pete was small and had what we call small man syndrome, which is like they get a lot taller when they've been drinking. They become 10 foot tall, bulletproof and invisible. Pete back then would readily have gone in the ring with Mike Tyson after a few pints of beer.
With Pete Willis on the brink of self-destruction, the group spent several months in 1982 recording their third album, Pyromania. Producer Mutt Lange set the pattern for the group's workaholic recording routine, a painstaking process of rewrites and retakes.
There was a lot of tears shed on that record, and a lot of drumsticks thrown, and a lot of guitars slammed down, and a lot of, I can't sing anymore, I've lost it. Because do it again, do it again. The Mutt was like a train, do it again, do it again, do it again.
As the grueling Pyromania sessions wore on, Pete Willis's problems with the bottle could no longer be ignored.
I just really got out of my brains one night, you know, drank a bottle of brandy or something like that, and I was very ill. I shouldn't have gone into the studio the next morning.
And we thought he was joking. We tried to take again, and I said, Pete, listen, you're going to have to go back to Sheffield and just cool out and come back when you've actually got yourself together.
We gave him what we call the Spanish Archer. elbow. You had to go.
And in some ways it was a relief. Don't get me wrong, you know, it sort of broke me in two really and destroyed my confidence quite a bit. But in another way it was quite a relief to get out of it.
The band picked up Londoner Phil Collin from the glam rock band Girl to replace Pete Willis.
Phil came in like a breath of fresh air. It did us the power of good. It gave us a new injection of life.
Finally, in 1983, after a long year in the studio, Pyromania was released and began a 92-week run on the U.S. charts, where it remained locked at #2 for 6 months, behind Michael Jackson's Thriller.
And we started that tour off playing the Marquee Club in London, which is about 800 people. We finished the tour 9 months later in Jack Murphy Stadium, which was 55,000 people or so.
With their star on the rise, the band soon fell prey to the pitfalls of life on the road. On stage, they were conquerors. Backstage, they were under siege. Coming up next, the high-speed wreck that would threaten a young drummer's life.
I guess as I rolled this car, the seatbelt was the thing that actually took my arm off.
And Steve Clark slips into an abyss of alcoholic despair.
Steve Clark was undoubtedly the unhappiest millionaire rock star I ever met in my life.
When Behind the Music continues. By storm. Soon their success met with excess.
You go and be polite and, you know, have a beer at the bar, and then when you shut yourself away in a room, that's when you get down to the serious drinking and drug taking.
We'd be offered things, and sometimes you just have to experiment, you know. You see a little cat, see a hole in a wall, sticks its head through. Maybe a dog will bite its head off the other side, maybe not.
It was a complete hoot. I loved it. You know, me and Steve used to get into a lot of trouble, usually involving drink and girls and the usual stuff.
Steve and Phil were a team. They were a team off the stage, and they were a team on the stage.
Whereas Aerosmith had the Toxic Twins, we had the Terror Twins.
An affectionate term for the pair of them.
We never let it overtake us. We've never gone on stage incapable of playing. And Steve, even at his worst, never went on stage drunk. Yeah, he had bad nights, but he had bad nights when he was sober.
By late 1983, Def Leppard had sold more than 6 million records and played to sell-out crowds around the world. They retreated to Ireland to work on the follow-up album, Hysteria, but old habits died hard for these rough-and-tumble rockers.
We went through an astonishing amount of alcohol when we lived in Booterstown in Dublin. We started saving the bottles after about the 10th day because we thought it'd be funny to see what we got through. We'd had piled up in the corner of one room 170-odd bottles of vodka, 150-odd bottles of scotch, and just a mountain of beer cans. You know, I mean, it was just ludicrous.
For me, it was I had to stop completely. I couldn't do the kind of social drinker, glass of wine thing. I tried that in the past, and it was glass of wine, bottle of wine. By the end of the week, it was Jack Daniels. And so I quit completely.
When Phil stopped drinking, Steve lost his drinking partner and felt more isolated.
Stopping wasn't even on his agenda.
We'd been together long enough to notice that, you know, there was a little too much drinking involved, and I went to the band and I approached them about it, and I said, you know, I think Steve's really got a drinking problem. And they just passed it off like, oh, you know, Steve's always liked a bit of the drop and you're just having marriage problems.
In mid-1984, the band went back into the studio to record Hysteria. When recording paused for the Christmas break, they returned home for the holidays. On New Year's Eve, drummer Rick Allen and his girlfriend Miriam Berenson were driving near Rick's parents' home in rural England.
When I was driving down the road in the Corvette, this red Alfa Romeo came screaming around the corner. He slowed up to the point where I started having to slow up. I tried to pass him, and every time I tried to pass him, this guy would speed up again. I lost my temper to the point where I don't even remember going around the corner. I think the first thing I remember was waking up or standing up in a field, and it was almost like some weird nightmare. Just standing up in this field and just saying, you know, well, I've lost my arm and I'm a drummer, you know. I guess as I rolled this car, The seatbelt was the thing that actually took my arm off. Because I remained conscious, I tensed to the point where I almost didn't bleed at all.
Luckily for Rick, two people who lived nearby were Doreen Billington, a retired nurse, and Tony Beavis, an off-duty police officer.
It was a bitterly cold day, and there was a biting wind coming down the valley. I couldn't find anyone at first, and then I saw this girl running round in the field. Looked over the wall and saw this boy. He said his first words to her was, "I'm a famous drummer and I've lost my arm. I'm Def Leppard." Well, I'd never heard of Def Leppard. So I got a handkerchief and some towels and just pressed on, and the clots were starting to form around the area which had been torn off. He wanted his mum. I remember him saying that to me, which I thought was rather sweet. The next friendly voice over the wall was Anthony, who said, "I'm an off-duty policeman, can I give you any assistance?" And I just looked up and said, "Oh, thank God, Anthony. Can you find his arm?"
The car itself was upturned, part of it being on the actual wall here and coming across into the actual roadway.
I crawled inside the car that was upturned, and there I found, underneath the actual dashboard, the chap's arm that had been severed from here right the way through.
And then the next voice over the wall was a district nurse and her husband, and she was just passing, and I said, "Oh, have you got any packs?" And she said yes.
And we managed to go and actually bandage the wound to some extent, and certainly to go and stem the actual bleeding and what have you.
It was quite some distance to be thrown from any vehicle. That he survived was quite honestly a miracle.
Rick was rushed to the hospital, where a surgical team performed an emergency 4-hour operation in which doctors reconnected Rick's severed limb. Still, it would be days before they would know if the operation was successful.
The main reason why it was done that way was to give him supposedly a good stump for an artificial arm. And over the period of the night, we had quite a few units of blood, to say the least. I remember going down for them. And unfortunately, it kept bleeding. The more we put in, the more came out.
New Year's Eve of all days, around about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I got a call from Peter Mensch, our manager, explaining what happened. It just didn't sink in.
He said, Rick's had a car crash, he's lost his arm. Now, this is not in the agenda. This doesn't make sense.
You forget about him being a drummer, you forget about him being a band member, you're worried whether the guy's actually going to live.
But I just remember going into the toilets at the hospital and just bursting out crying again because I couldn't stand to look at him. I couldn't stand it. His brother made me touch his hand after the attack to the arm and said, "Feel, it's warm." And he was. He felt normal.
Could see his hand, and it was so pink, and I thought, you know, they've done it.
But, to everyone's horror, Rick's reattached limb became infected. Reluctantly, the surgeons removed his left arm, this time for good.
It's almost like giving you something back and then taking it away for the second time. It seemed very, very cruel.
That was one sort of slight hiccup. And then the thing that really got to me was when they said that if I didn't clear this infection up, that there was a real possibility that I might lose my right arm as well. And that's when things got all dark and serious again. It was like, oh, no way.
Coming up next, Rick Allen fights back, the return of the one-armed drummer.
It was almost like I was running on pure adrenaline. I was just hell-bent on getting back in there and, you know, and making the band happy.
And Steve Clark loses the battle with his private demons.
Apparently, the alcohol in his blood was double what killed John Bonham.
When Behind the Music continues. In 1984, Def Leppard's bad luck had taken a brutal twist with the near-fatal car crash of their drummer Rick Allen. But Rick refused to accept the idea that his terrible injury would end his musical career. He resolved to play the drums again.
Me and Steve seen him in hospital, and he was all done up like a mummy, you know, it was like, you know, blood seeping out, and just laying in the bed, and he said, "I've been practicing, I'm going to play drums." And we're like, I mean, it was almost the first thing he said. We thought, it's medication.
Things were exciting again. Things were really, you know, I've got a goal. I've got a goal in life. I've got, you know, I've got something to work towards.
Richard said that life was too easy. He was doing exactly what he wanted. He was travelling the world, and this was the kick up the backside that he needed. And I said, "Richard, it had no need to have been such a hard kick."
In a show of loyalty, the band hesitated to replace Rick Allen. They decided instead to remain on hiatus until Rick might return.
There's no way he's going to get fired. I mean, he's like a brother. He's part of the family. It's up to him to tell us that he can't play it. So we played the coward role.
With Rick in the hospital, Def Leppard returned to the studio to continue work on the Hysteria album. Then, just 6 weeks after his accident, Rick rejoined the group, determined to keep the beat with one arm.
It's very emotional when he came back. There were a lot of tears and what have you, but we locked him away in a room with a drum kit.
This bass drum and snare drum and a hi-hat and a stool. And he sat there working away for about 15 minutes, and then he almost collapsed.
It was almost like I was running on pure adrenaline. I was just hell-bent on getting back in there and making the band happy.
While the band continued to labor in the studio, Rick spent 8 hours a day mastering a custom-built electronic drum kit that allowed him to play left-handed beats with his left foot.
It was just starting back at the basics again, and realizing that the information was in my head. It just needed to be channeled somewhere else. Although I couldn't get it out here, you know, I could get it to other parts of my body.
Then, in the midst of Rick's heroic comeback, the band was invited to perform on the Monsters of Rock tour, a series of European dates that featured Ozzy Osbourne and Bon Jovi. It was to be Rick Allen's one-armed return to the concert stage.
You know, a few people said, oh, you know, you're not going to let the freak show get up on stage or whatever. And it was like, that kind of hurt.
The big test was actually going out and doing it live.
In preparation, the band planned a series of small club dates in Ireland. At Rick Allen's suggestion, drummer Jeff Rich was brought in to back him up. But traveling to the third date, Jeff Rich's flight was delayed, and he missed the start of the show. Rick Allen had to go it alone. He didn't skip a beat.
About 45 minutes into the gig, a very sheepish Jeff Rich turns up and sneaks onto his kit and joins in. Didn't even notice, and that's the highest compliment I can pay Rick for that.
After the gig, Jeff came up to me and he just said, well, it's been nice knowing you. I think you can do this on your own.
On August 16, 1986, at the Monsters of Rock Festival, Rick Allen made his first arena concert appearance since his accident. When Rick was introduced, the crowd exploded.
I swear, it was like a hairdryer. I mean, the volume nearly blew you off stage. It was frightening, the reaction that the guy got.
You're talking 70,000 people. It was extremely emotional.
Tears everywhere up there, and I've never seen anything like that. And I've never felt anything like that before. It's like I'd arrived, you know, it was brilliant. It was a really good feeling.
It was one of the greatest comebacks in rock history. From that day, Rick Allen became known as the Thunder God.
It did make us a lot stronger and think about things in a different way. It's like, if he can do this after losing a limb, then how dare we moan about, oh, we can't get the bridge right in this song, or oh, I've just missed a flight to Paris, or, you know, how dare we do that?
After a 3-year tragedy-plagued recording ordeal that left the band deeply in debt, Hysteria, the band's 4th album, was finally released in August of 1987. But by then, many fans had forgotten about Def Leppard. They had been out of the limelight for far too long. The first single flopped, and early tour dates were played to half-empty houses. Deeply in debt, the band needed to sell at least 5 million albums just to break even.
And we stalled at 3, and it was like, oh, okay. Which is still great, but not good enough, unfortunately.
And then they released Pour Some Sugar on Me, and then it just went ballistic. He went absolutely ballistic. He shifted 4 million albums in 3 months. It had gone in at #1 in England. We'd finally achieved success in our home country for the first time 10 years after we'd formed.
So there we are back on tour. We come back to the States because we was in Europe, and everywhere sold out.
What at first looked like disaster turned to triumph as Hysteria spawned 7 hit singles, sold 10 million copies in the U.S. and nearly 15 million worldwide. Def Leppard headlined an unforgettable 13-month world tour performed in the round. Performing in the round presented new challenges for the band, but the boys dealt with the situation in their own wild way.
When you're running around trying to cover 4 sides of a stage, comes a moment when you need a break. And so they manufactured this moment in the show whereby all the guitar players would all go underneath the stage, and Joe and Rick would be left on the stage.
I'm going around the whole crowd doing this whole winding them up, getting them going.
What do you want?
While this is going on, underneath the stage, where Rick Savage and Phil and Steve Clark are, and all the roadies and the other guests that happen to be around, would be in there with a whole load of women.
It would be like Sodom and Gomorrah going on for 20 minutes.
Their passport into the under the stage area was they had to take their tops off and get their out. That was the bargain.
There would be 60 naked girls, and I mean with nothing on, you know, completely. Mothers and daughters performing sexual acts. I mean, it was just full. It was like Caligula.
Satyricon. That's what it was. Fellini's Satyricon. These weird little sex scenes going on. Some nights it got a little crazier than others. And they would photograph all this. Inevitably, though, Rick Allen and Joe Elliott come out of it really squeaky clean because, of course, they were never below the stage. But the others were. So was I.
In October 1988, after 15 months on the road, Def Leppard concluded the Hysteria tour in Seattle. It was to be Steve Clark's last show with the band.
I think it really hit Steve hard that this is getting harder. Every album we do is getting bigger and bigger. How the hell do we top this one? And I think that started to get to him.
Countless nights I sat with Steve Clark while he was chopping out a coke. And as he was doing it, he'd be going, "Don't tell the others. Don't tell the others."
He didn't ever want to have the band learn about it, and the band didn't want to learn about it because then they would have had to look at their own addictions.
Before the first show of the Hysteria tour, he was so desperately trying to break his fingers so he wouldn't have to go on stage the next night. He was slamming them against the marble sink in his bathroom. He was just scared to death to go on stage. He was okay after the first gig. It's the first one.
Then in late 1989, Steve Clark was found lying comatose in a gutter.
Steve was found in a coma in Minneapolis. Apparently, the alcohol in his blood was double what killed John Bonham. I mean, that's astonishing.
Coming up next, Steve Clark is admitted to a psychiatric hospital.
I mean, this was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There is one of my best friends in with the lamppost scratchers, the ones that talk to trees.
And Rick Allen is arrested for attacking his wife.
What happened had nothing to do with me. That I can tell you. It had to do with alcohol and a temper.
When Behind the Music continues.
That's it. Next 10 years. Well, who knows what that has in store after the last 10. Car accident, things. Well, I hope we're still together. It'd be a shame if we weren't. I don't think we'll probably do another 15-month tours. We'll still be making records.
Desperately ill from years of alcohol abuse, Steve Clark was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Minneapolis.
There is one of my best friends in with the lamppost scratchers, the ones that talk to trees. I mean, it's... why? Why is he in here?
It was very hard to convince everyone that there was a real problem there. You know, his girlfriend at the time, Lorelei, had been telling me for like 5 years.
He had a chemical imbalance, and it was painful. Like I said, he had voices and, you know, the compulsive behavior disorder. He was scared, and he was really lonely.
Steve Clark was undoubtedly the unhappiest millionaire, rock star I ever met in my life.
You can't sell 12 million records and not earn any money. But it can create some very weird situations with friends and people you used to know.
Everyone thinks if they have a drink problem, they go to Betty Ford, they come out, they're cured, you know. It's not like that.
I think a lot of his frustration came from the fact that he never got a pat on the back from his dad.
He loved his father, but he was scared to death of him because his father also had that mean streak where one minute he'd be happy and laughing and the next minute he wouldn't be a very nice guy.
His dad used to like getting drunk, and it was like, "Come on, son, let's go and have a drink." Even this was after Clark's been in the clinic 3 months. He never realised that Clark couldn't have 3 drinks, he had to drink 10. I don't think his family helped him. I think the fact is that Clark didn't give a He went to rehab because everybody made him.
He was home for maybe 10 days. He had to go back to work in Dublin, you know, the World Pub, and write again for the next album. So off he was, back with the band, drinking again.
In Dublin, the sessions for the band's fifth album, Adrenalize, were constantly interrupted by repeated attempts to help Steve.
I mean, we basically made Malvin, our tour manager, live with him to keep an eye on him, which was must have been a god-awful task for Malvin because it was impossible.
You know, I'd stand there and tell him, Steve, I love you. Please don't do this. Please don't do this, because you're hurting. You know, you can hurt me as much as you like, but you're hurting yourself big time and full time.
He went into rehab in Dublin, and for 1 month they needed family member to be there. And once a week I went in and basically just tried to make him feel bad. And he'd just sit there in his boiler suit, picking his nails, not even hearing a word I was saying. And then at the end of it he'd say, thanks for coming. And he'd been there for a month, and then the day he checks out, he goes straight to the pub and gets blind drunk and falls down.
Painfully aware that their efforts to help Steve help himself were futile, the band attempted one last desperate tactic.
So we gave him a 6-month leave of absence. Why don't you just go back to your house? He'd bought this house in Chelsea in London. Why don't you go back to your house, chill out, write songs, demo them, do whatever you like, you know. Get up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but get well.
He was relieved and happy to be given the chance and the space. And it was a little bit of relief, I have to admit, on our point of view, from our point of view as well.
And of course, the 6 months never elapsed.
There was a point in there where I called his parents and I said, you need to help him.
He came on for Christmas 1990. We could see that he was really looking worse for wear. But I had words with him, if he carried on drinking like this, he'd kill himself. And he said, oh, well, I'm not bothered anyway. Just like that. And I said, well, nobody's ever come back from dead to say what it was really like.
And by now he was mixing Valiums, Prozacs, alcohol, Coke, whatever anybody would give him. And his heart was just, you know, beating, trying so hard to stay alive. But really, he was really slowly trying to kill himself. And when you combined all that pain with the Prozac and the alcohol and the cocaine and the Valiums and the stress, I think his little heart just gave out. And I think he died of a broken heart.
Steve Clark died in his sleep at his home in London on January 8, 1991. He was 30 years old. An autopsy ruled his death due to compression of the brainstem from excessive alcohol mixed with antidepressants and painkillers.
I really miss him every time the show starts. I go home to Sheffield at least once a year, usually at Christmas time. I go up to his grave and I sit there for a little while with him. It's freezing cold. Normally it's on the side of a hill, the wind whipping through. I just huddle down and I just stay there for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I'm not that spiritually inclined, but I do it for him.
I think my initial thing was like, don't want to do this no more, it's not the same.
Why are we doing this anyway? It's kind of supposed to be fun, right?
It didn't take us long to actually understand, you know, Steve wouldn't wanted us to do that at all. He'd have said, carry on.
Living with the ghost of Steve Clark, the band returned to the studio to complete Adrenalize.
We wanted to finish the album off as a 4-piece, just out of human respect to Steve and his family.
We'd worked all these guitar parts out, so I had to play his parts like him. I had to sit down and that was really strange. It was like the ghost, you know, it's like, there he is.
It's very real. Studios and music are escapism, and real life intrudes enormously when people in the band die.
The idea of getting someone else was weird. It's like a replacement. It's like, how do you replace someone? You don't replace a family member, you know, and you can't. We talked about it for ages, and we ended up getting Vivian.
We'd known Viv for a while. We knew him as a person. That was so important.
It's a lot more to do with being able to work with people than necessarily being, you know, an Olympian athlete at your instrument, you know.
You know, he may not look like Steve, he may not play like Steve, but he fits in perfectly.
Couldn't sing, couldn't play guitar, but great soccer player. Let's put him in the band, you know.
Vivian Campbell made his major concert debut when Def Leppard joined Brian May and the members of Queen for the Freddie Mercury Concert of Life at Wembley Stadium.
I was just blown out of my seat, you know. I had no idea the impact that they were going to make. I'd never seen the place sort of rise as one man to its feet. It was incredible. Joe has all the answers. He said to me, he said, Brian, this is a long time ago, he said, I figure you can be a rock and roll star as long as you keep your hair and you don't get fat, right? Do you want to get right?
Greeted with the usual mix of critical disdain and public delight, the band's fifth album, Adrenalize, debuted at #1 in the spring of 1992. The following tour carried none of the baggage of the touring past. They were a lean, mean rockin' machine. In mid-1993, they were given a hero's welcome by their hometown of Sheffield and staged a standing room only performance at Don Valley Stadium. But for Def Leppard, every successful high was undercut by a staggering low. On July 5, 1995, Rick Allen was arrested on charges of spousal abuse at Los Angeles Airport after grabbing his wife Stacy by the throat, dragging her into a restroom, and slamming her head against a wall.
It was one of those times when I just completely lost my mind.
What happened had nothing to do with me. That I can tell you. It had to do with alcohol and a temper. And they just don't go together.
My own addictions were also starting to come to the surface and show themselves in ways that I never dreamt possible.
I did what was right. Richard got arrested.
She called the police right there and then, and I was locked up for part of that night.
And he had to go into rehab. I mean, there was no way that I could let our relationship continue.
I gave myself over to the fact that I was probably going to spend the rest of my days, locked up. I just had the most amazing sort of feelings of respect for Stacy, having allowed me to work through my problems, and her not just sort of turning her back on on the entire sort of relationship.
Two people have to want the same goal. One person can't make it work. And we have a child now, we have new focuses, and we need to continually try to make our lives work for us and our family.
Coming up next, an older, wiser Def Leppard revealed the key to longevity.
The one thing you never lose sight of is the original fire that you had when you were 16. The only difference is it's just another decade or two.
When Behind the Music continues. In 1995, Def Leppard began work on a new album entitled Slang. It was to be a dynamic departure from their previous successes. It had come time for the band to reinvent itself.
Nirvana stormed out in 1991 with a completely new thing, and it made everyone sit up and think.
These bands are coming out, and they were fighting the sound of bands like us. We were Beelzebub to them. We were the enemy.
But it is ironic when you turn on the radio and you hear an anarcho band like Chumbawamba with a chorus that says, "I get knocked down." There's a Leppard influence, I think.
The whole album was interrupted by the Greatest Hits record, which was thrown into our lap as an idea halfway through making the Slang record.
On October 23, 1995, as a promotional stunt to trumpet the release of their Greatest Hits compilation, Vault, Def Leppard performed 3 concerts on 3 continents within the same day: Africa, Great Britain, and Canada.
We all do silly things sometimes, and there's no greater way than publicising your greatest hits than doing something outrageous. But I think I'd rather bungee jump next time.
We got in the Guinness Book of Records, and it was fun, and we'll probably try and do it again one day, and try and figure out 4.
Having outlasted the great majority of their 80s hard rock contemporaries, Def Leppard released Slang worldwide in early 1996. The album marked a new, more experimental musical approach.
Bands like REM and U2 are very good and are allowed to do a complete 360 every time they put an album out. We wanted to test the water, see if people would allow us to move on.
And I actually enjoyed the tour because we weren't drinking, we weren't drug taking. It was a slang tour, and we had it was fun. It was actually doing America and enjoying it.
It's almost like coming full circle. The one thing you never lose sight of is the original fire that you had when you were 16. The only difference is it's just another decade or two.
In spite of all the trauma and tragedy, Def Leppard is literally a band that does not know when to quit. To this day, talent, determination, and stamina remain their tools for survival.
We're about a team. We're about a family, really. You know, we've grown up together. We've experienced, you know, from having nothing to experiencing really high highs together and actually turning into men, basically, from boys.
The band has gone through that whole crisis period, and we have a much more cohesive vision as to what sort of a record we should make. That makes it easier for us all to see light at the end of the tunnel.
At this stage of our career, we have to look at people like the Stones and Aerosmith and go, look, these guys are in their 50s. You know, we're still all in our 30s.
We have overcome a lot of things. We definitely have. And you could look at it as saying that, you know, now we're battling against time. It is quite easy sometimes to actually take the opposite view and actually think that time could be our friend.
And for Rick Allen, a new life means a new start.
It's definitely a new start. Now I have Lauren. I really realize that whatever goes on outside of our home, you know, it really doesn't matter. I don't even wear a watch anymore. It's like, well, I lost the other one, but I don't wear a watch on this, you know, on this wrist anymore. Simply because, you know, I really don't want to live by the time.
He turned me on to scuba diving. We race cars together. He plays tennis. He water skis with me. There's nothing he won't do. Nothing.
I have to keep working. I have to keep myself busy. Otherwise, you know, I hear voices. You know, they tell me to do the wrong things.
It's a bit silly if people think that there's, you know, the curse of Def Leppard or something like that, and then expect lightning and thunder to go off as I say those words. Think about it logically. You've got 5 people for the last 18 years pretty much lived in and out of each other's pockets. We've had one guy die and a guy have a very serious accident. And there's been a hell of a lot more good times than bad times. You know, and I don't think that we will maintain an audience through sympathy. We'll maintain an audience by constantly making great records.
Stick around for more Def Lep. Up next, it's an all-deaf VH1 rock show, followed by Def Leppard storytellers. So sit back and pour some sugar on yourself. Double Deaf is up next, only on VH1.
Goddamn, I look to get connected, but it's out of my head.